do that as well. But okay, we are going. So I'm Dr. Brian Kinslow.
I'm Abby Chan.
Yeah. So where you guys know us, but we're from Evolve Flagstaff. And anybody's watching this after, we're recording this in the midst of the COVID-19 closure. So that's affecting us all. We're trying to come every week with a webinar that can help us get through this time, and hopefully get through it in a way that's healthy, and we come out maybe with some better habits and stronger than we went into it. So today we're talking about stress and mental health, some things that you can be doing now, but really these are things that should be part of a good self-care routine all the time. So hopefully you guys can leave with that. And just a quick disclaimer, we're not mental health professionals. We are health professionals, but not mental health professionals. So I'm a physical therapist, Abby's a dietitian. What we do closely impacts mental health, and we talk about it from time to time with our patients, but we refer out a lot too. And so if you're struggling with a mental health condition, this is not a substitute for treatment for that, and we definitely encourage you to talk to somebody who is credentialed in that field. With that out of the way, hand it over to Andy.
Yeah, so there are 58 million Americans who actually suffer with mental health disorders. So those are a variety of things. And again, we're not going to really be diving hardcore into those. But I think it's really important to know and think about that basically 6.8 of Americans have been prescribed antidepressants since 1999, and that has increased to 13%. So we've had basically a twofold increase in the last 20 years of prescription. Granted, whether that's awareness, whether that's seeking help, a lot of those things are in play with that. But I think it's really important to note that our lifestyles are also really impacting our lives and how we're actually, and our overall quality of life. So when we look at, sorry, we're trying to share a mouse here. So when we look at mental health, it is important to think of all of the confounding factors that are going to play into it. So obviously genetics are going to play a role. If it's some sort of actual biochemical imbalance, that can definitely be inherited. That's definitely genetically related. Substance use will have a huge impact on not only genetics, but also physiology, how your body reacts to things. There's a lot of, obviously, we know that we're all like, sorry, let me rephrase this. We are all one unit. And so we are all connected and all of our systems are connected. So if we are taking a substance that's going to impact, say, our gut or even obviously our brain and have some sort of psychoactive effect, that's going to then impact our overall mental health as well as all the other systems in our body. Trauma has a huge impact. Trauma also has ways that it also impacts our physical bodies as well. So there's a lot of great research on that, but know that that is going to have a huge impact. Any sort of brain injury or like TBI, concussion, those are going to have an impact. And then overall health, which is where we're going to be talking a lot about today, of how these things impact mental health and also impact stress. So here's generally a team that you kind of want around you when you are trying to seek help for mental health. So definitely psychologists. They are licensed professionals that specialize in evaluation and treatment of mental disorders. Counselors are a lot of times the front lines and social workers, a lot of times the front lines of dealing with whether it's talk therapy or things like that. So they are really, really great and great resources. Psychiatrists will help with prescription of medication. So again, if you do have some sort of imbalance or something like that, medications can be very helpful. And then a lot of people don't think about it, but registered dietitians. We work a lot. I work personally with substance use and substance abuse. And so I see a lot of things that where we can actually impact on re-nourishing the body again and starting to bring back a lot of nutrients that may have been or most likely been deficient for a long period of time, and really start to optimize the body so that we can let our brains and our bodies heal again. It's
month.
yours.
All right. So that's kind of a brief primer of mental health conditions. We're going to focus mostly today on just stress as a broad category. I think that's a little more in our sweet spot of what we deal with here, although we are, as Abby said, involved in treatment of mental health. But as a broad category, stress is a big deal, and it's actually a big problem in the U.S. In a survey in 2018, this was before any of the COVID stuff, the United States is the most stressed nation in the world. So 55% of Americans report that they experience high levels of stress for a lot of the day, compared to just 35% globally. And so what's going on there? So we want to talk about first, what does stress look like in the body? Because if we understand what it is on a physiological level, then we can intervene and hopefully put a stop to things. Because we have to go to work, we're going to have families, not every day is going to be perfect. But if we can better understand stress, then we can manage it a little more effectively. So we're going to talk about the nervous system quite a bit today. So the nervous system that's basically what runs your body in the background. So it's more or less automatic. It does things without your conscious control, things like your heart rate, your blood pressure, your breathing, your hormones, your endocrine systems. All this stuff is regulated by your nervous system. But what your nervous system is doing affects how you feel. It affects how you think in a lot of ways. And so even though it's kind of running in the background as our operating system, it's really important to understand how it works. There's two big branches of the autonomic nervous system. So there's the sympathetic nervous system. That's what's commonly called the fight or flight nervous system. Or freeze, because that's kind of we evolved this branch of the nervous system to respond to a stressor. So if you think about an animal under stress, so for example, last night I was doing something in the kitchen, and we were on the couch watching a stressful show, Homeland. But then I went in the kitchen, and Kona doesn't see great in the dark, and I came around the corner and I totally spooked her. And her sympathetic nervous system went wild. She started barking at me. She went into fight mode. I don't think she can bite people, but it was as frightening as Kona gets. And that was her sympathetic nervous system going into fight mode. She saw a stressor, an intruder, and she went to go fight it. And so other animals might run away. That's the flight. Or they might freeze and kind of hide. And so humans have the same thing. When we get in a stressful situation, we might lash out. So anger would be a fight response. We might avoid something. So that's our flight response or our freeze response sometimes. Or we might actively deny that it's going on in the first place. So we have these fight or flight or freeze responses, and that's run by our sympathetic nervous system. Our parasympathetic nervous system, that evolved to help us recover from stress. So Kona, after she realized it was me, and she was a little embarrassed, she grabbed a toy, and then she went back on the couch, and within 2 minutes, she was back asleep. So her parasympathetic nervous system took over and said, the stressor is gone, and now I can chill out. And so where humans tend to go wrong is that we get very sympathetically dominant, and we don't get that parasympathetic nervous system input. We can't do what Kona did as well and just shut off after a stressor. We think about it, we ruminate on it, more stressors come in that keep us wound up, and this affects our physiology and it affects how we feel. So to give you an example of
I want to go over a few do's and don'ts first.
Oh.
So
sorry about that. We're working off another slideshow that
had me video record over it.
Yeah. We'll work through it here. So the sympathetic nervous system, it does certain things to our physiology. So it's going to elevate our heart rate. It's going to elevate our blood pressure. It's going to send blood to our muscles. So it's getting you ready to run away from something or to fight something. It's going to keep you alert, at least temporarily. And so this is where people in stressful situations can survive on less sleep until they can't, and then they crash. It often allows you to make quick judgment calls based a lot of times on instinct. So you kind of gauge the situation quickly and you make a move. But it can lead to tunnel vision, meaning you miss some of the finer details, or you're reacting on emotion more than the whole story. It's going to slow your digestion rate because your body's going to be more of an emergency mode. So it's not concerned about digesting your last meal. It's more concerned about getting blood and oxygen to where it needs to go. You're going to have less restful sleep, because imagine hunter-gatherers, if they were in a stressful environment, they don't want to fall into a very deep sleep because they're at risk. So it's called your reticular activating system in your brain is going to be more alert to little noises in the night. So you're not going to sleep as well. And then it alters pain perception. And so I work with chronic pain patients a fair bit, and often they're on sympathetic overdrive and their body sees everything as a threat, and non-painful input for most people now becomes very painful because their body's on high alert. The parasympathetic nervous system is going to do kind of the opposite of all that. It's going to slow the heart rate down. It's going to reduce our blood pressure. It's going to promote digestion. It's going to promote sleepiness and a deeper sleep. It's going to allow you to think a little more clearly, although maybe a little bit slower. And it's going to support cellular recovery, when we think about injury or healing of the gastrointestinal system. So those are some of what each of these do. And it's important to know that they're neither good nor bad, even though as I'm describing it, it sounds like sympathetic nervous system is bad and parasympathetic is good. And that's only because you probably are realizing that we fall more into one camp than another as people in the United States. But we do need both. If you're getting ready to exercise, you need your sympathetic nervous system to bring you up. If you are in a stressful situation that you have to manage, you want your sympathetic nervous system to help you stay focused and on task. And so we need them both, but we just need them in balance. So if we think about why we might be out of balance, and this took me like so long to put together this
stressed him out.
Yeah, creating this little diagram stressed me out.
It's called a word cloud, by the way.
But if you think about everything that we get hit with in a normal day as 21st century Americans, it's a ton of sympathetic input. Every time you get an alert on your phone, your brain thinks it's something it has to deal with. Every time you get an email, you got to deal with that. There's to-do lists, there's traffic, there's pollution, injuries, caffeine, alcohol, if your microbiome's not in a good spot, blue light, lack of sleep, all this stuff that we have to deal with in the 21st century is, for better or for worse, a sympathetic input. And so it's keeping our bodies revved up. And now we got COVID-19 to deal with, and we have all this existential stress, and you might have gotten laid off, or your job situation is
up in the air.
Yep. And so you're going to be in more of a sympathetic state unless you take steps to manage it. So how do we better manage this? So we came up with four categories of things that we're going to go over today. So we have move, eat, connect, and chill. So we're going to talk about these four categories, but these are basically how we intervene and promote more parasympathetic activity in a sympathetic world. So the first one is movement. So exercise, when it comes to stress, is essential. The human bodies were made to move. There was a study that I love on chronic pain. I love it because there was one quote in there where they said that the normal state of the nervous system is one that's in the context of physical activity. And that when they looked at what the nervous system is without activity in physically inactive states, it looked like there was a disease process going on. So we were designed to move. Exercise promotes blood flow, reduces inflammation. In some studies for certain types of mental health conditions, it has as powerful effect as some pharmaceuticals. And generally people who have higher levels of exercise and relative fitness can better handle a higher level of stress. Not always, but on the whole, we see people who have a little more strength, a little more cardiovascular fitness are a little more robust when something gets thrown their way. However, not all exercise is equal. We're going to dive into that in a second. But crucially, and I see this as a physical therapist with overuse injuries, is that exercise can't be your only tool. Because if it's your only tool, what are you doing? You're just fighting or flighting. You're just running from that stressor, using your stress energy and translating it into exercise. And so if exercise is a helpful tool for you, that's great. But if it's causing pain or injuries, or if you don't have any other tools that allow you to take a rest day away from exercise, then we want to intervene and give you some other things to work on your stress with.
Well, and I think this is also really essential too. I work also with a lot of eating disorders or even disordered eating patterns where people are using exercise as their stress relief. And it's starting to compound, which we'll talk more deeply in a moment about, but it starts to compound these other factors. And if for some reason they either can't exercise or that's like limited for them for some reason, then they have nothing else. And so that's, I think, where we run into the paradigm where exercise is my de-stressor, where that's great and it should be used sometimes, but we need to have a lot of other things in there that are also going to be really effective tools.
Yeah. So when I say all exercise is not equal, some are going to be more sympathetically dominant. I think this is really important now for a lot of the home workouts that are all over social media, because certain types of exercise are going to be more parasympathetic and certain are more sympathetic. So more parasympathetic stuff is typically your easier walking or cycling or swimming. So think something you can breathe in and out of your nose while doing. Hiking is going to be a little more than that. And then here at Evolve, we promote a fair bit of what we call heavy, slow resistance training. Heavy is going to be relative for you, but slow, meaning you're going to do a set. You might be a little out of breath because it was effortful, but then you're going to take a rest break and then go again once you're recovered after a minute or two. And that's in contrast to a lot of the workout classes out there that are often HIIT or interval based. And there's a whole theory as to why we don't only do HIIT workouts, but one of the reasons is because it fries your nervous system. If you're always going hard all the time, then your body has a hard time recovering. And we know that people walking in the door are dealing with a fair bit of sympathetic stress already. And so if we just do every single workout as a high intensity interval training circuit, that's very hard on the nervous system to recover from. Not so much workout soreness, although that's a factor, but more kind of how the body's dealing with that on the back end. And so kind of going down that list, a hard running workout might be harder on the nervous system than a hard lifting workout, because that lifting workout, your heart rate's going to be fairly low on average compared to the run. And then we got some body weight interval circuits, and then the weighted stuff, whether that's dumbbells or bands or barbells, which most people don't have at home now, but those are going to be the hardest for you to recover from, particularly if you have a high stress load outside of that. So when you think about your exercise, it doesn't always have to look the same throughout the year. So I know if I'm having a very stressful time, and that was one of them, I might do a lot more easy aerobic work and some slow weightlifting and less circuit training, because I'm just going to feel better. I'm going to sleep better. I'm going to wake up feeling more recovered.
And I think there's also there's some research and ideas around the idea. I don't really like using the word addict very much because it's a really loaded term, but the idea of being sort of addicted to these like stress hormones. And it's just like any other chemical in our body. If our body's used to this really heightened state, then it's used to getting this feedback loop all the time. So if we have a really high stress job, we're stressed all the time, we're always using some sort of either upper or downer, whether that's coffee or alcohol to get us through the day, and then hitting our really high intensity class and doing it all over again, that's starting to, again, ingrain that feedback pathway. So if we can start to break that, it's hard in the beginning, but it can be much better and more beneficial later on if we can actually start to downregulate a little bit.
Yeah.
And then balance that out.
And so where I'd caution everybody listening to this is just getting their workout programs from Instagram, because even at Evolve, we're guilty of it too, because you can only share so much in a one photo and caption or a 1 minute video. And so it's much easier to share the high intensity interval circuits. It's much harder to share, hey, go for a walk for 30 to 60 minutes, breathing in and out through your nose, and then do some mobility work. That's not as exciting on social media. But if that's your only source of a workout program, you could end up digging yourself in a deeper hole. And I'm not saying that stuff's not good sometimes, but that should be maybe 20 to 30% of your training, maybe less if you're very stressed, as opposed to 80, 90%. Okay, so moving on from exercise, if you guys have any questions, you can jump in, but we're going to move on from exercise.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If, especially in like a stressful situation like this, but also like going forward into sort of the rest of life, like you mentioned that 20 to 30% or less of that high intensity sympathetic kind of exercise is good, do you think that a person could have like a high level of fitness and be healthy doing like no sympathetic nervous system exercise?
Potentially. I mean, I think if you're, so, the minimum recommendations for exercise are we want at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic exercise a week. So I'd put that more in the parasympathetic category if you're not going too hard. And then 2 to 3 times a week is some resistance training. And so if you're hitting that, you could probably be just fine. When we look at athletic performance, that's kind of a different story as most, but again, the dosage is small. So there's a classic study where they looked at Olympians across a lot of different distances of events, and they on average did 10 to 20% of their workloads at high intensities. And so, yeah, I think you could definitely be healthy without a lot of high intensity exercises. There are times when high intensity is indicated. So there's some studies showing that for blood pressure and diabetes, we want to hit some high intensity because it has a stronger effect on the disease process that's going on. And then, I think for some people, truly going to their max in small doses can be very effective for a lot of reasons. But as a general rule, I think not necessarily. It's not required to go hard.
And I think there's also too, we can toe that line a little bit of like this gray area in between those arrows sort of the slow resistance. So it's like you can easily go for a jog, and depending on your cardiovascular fitness, you might be able to generally breathe through your nose for the majority of the time. So that's still going to get your heart rate up, which is something that we want for cardiovascular health, but it's not going to be a full out sprint, or it's not going to be this huge heavy breathing that you couldn't carry a conversation. So I think that that's where that can fit in really nicely too. And I think when we say high intensity, where our minds automatically go are like the crazy, like drill sergeant instructors that you're like crushing it. But really when they look at the studies with diabetics, high intensity is whatever's high intensity for that person. So it may be walking for that person, or it may be walking up a hill, so those dosages of like high intensity is very specific. And what we think of it in our lay terms is, again, that drill sergeant, when it really doesn't have to be to get that same physiological response.
Yeah. I would say though, I think people who want to be healthy and have jobs or busy lives otherwise tend to fall in this middle zone where they're doing a lot of their workouts, not truly low intensity, but fairly high. And so they end up getting a mediocre fitness benefit, but a high stress load. And so I think, that's why that influences how we program here at Evolve. But I think it's worth thinking about, it's called polarized training, doing a very small bit at high intensity for you, and then a fair bit more at a lower intensity. And I had a slide in here. I took it out just because I want to stay on time, but I think it's worth mentioning. We talk about nasal breathing in terms of, with regard to low intensity exercise and breathing a fair bit. So when you breathe in and out through your nose, it actually stimulates better oxygenation of the blood. It's kind of cool here at altitude, actually, because there's a little more resistance through your nose when you're breathing. It helps better perfuse the lung tissue, and it's to some extent small, but to some extent simulates a lower altitude environment. And so it also, you have better increased release of nitric oxide, so that vasodilates you. And so breathing in and out through your nose is a powerful tool. Even that in itself has a parasympathetic effect. And so if we're trying to downregulate somebody or regulate their aerobic intensity, we'll often program some nasal breath work or nasal breathing during their aerobic work. So you don't even need a heart rate monitor to do it. You can just go out and go as hard as you can, but without losing that nasal breathing. And if you've never done it before, it'll probably be slower than you're used to.
And the last thing on this is that I think that a lot of times I get this question a lot with athletes of like, so you're telling me to chill out, but I don't have enough time. And especially athletes who are not professional and they still have jobs. They're like, well, I have to get my workout in the morning. So then therefore they're cutting their sleep short to hopefully get in that exercise, where there's actually research studies showing that it's more beneficial from an athlete standpoint to actually get that rest and that recovery and to skip a workout as opposed to hitting that workout in already a deficit state.
Cool.
Cool. Thanks for that question, Sasha.
Okay. Yeah. Any other questions on exercise? I know we kind of went on a tangent there. All right.
Cool.
So just to kind of keep you in track, we have 4 categories of things. We had move was one, to help manage stress. The next one we're going to go over is chill. So essentially we got to chill out. So the sympathetic nervous system gets us hyped up, and most people don't do things to come down from that. So activities that promote some parasympathetic activity, there's a whole ton of them, but essentially it's getting away from your devices. Devices emit blue light, which actually changes how you produce melatonin, so it makes it harder to fall asleep. So you can get blue light blocking glasses, and they almost always look very cool. So you can look good with your significant other. There we go, Sasha. All right. Some deep nasal breathing, which we talked about, meditation or mindfulness. There's a lot of apps out there. Journaling, walking, yoga, sleep, as Abby mentioned, is essential. So if you're in a sleep deficit, essentially what that's saying, if you think about how humans evolved, we had ample time to sleep as much as we want for most of the time. If we were limited on sleep, that was probably because we were in a food shortage. So we had to get up early to find food in an emergency situation, or we were maybe nomadic. So we had to get up early to get away from some type of threat. And so adequate sleep automatically tells your body that something is wrong. And so getting 7 to 8 hours at a minimum is essential. If you're getting, if you feel like you have to get 10, 11, 12 or more to feel rested, then that's a different issue. We should look into what's causing you to be so tired, but a sweet spot tends to be like 7.5 to 9. Painting or drawing or creating something artistic, and then spending time in nature. There's some studies, the Japanese call it forest bathing, which is essentially just like walking in the woods. But it lowers your cortisol, lowers your blood pressure, lowers your heart rate, improves your heart rate variability, which is a measure of parasympathetic nervous system activity. So any of these are good, but I would stress to find what works for you, because what chills you out might not relax somebody else. So for example, yoga, Abby is an amazing yoga teacher. I like yoga from a mobility standpoint, but I end up thinking a lot during yoga. Like it's not that it stresses me out, but it doesn't de-stress me. I don't turn off when I do it. And so if I think about, for me, it's more of like part of my workout thing rather than a parasympathetic activity. So that's fine, but that's how I think about it for me. Whereas some people, that's where they can breathe, they can move, they can de-stress, they can play, and yoga is incredible for them. And so really you have to find out what works for you, and play around with it and just see how you feel after you try some of these things.
I like to think of these, again, going back to like the toolbox idea, is that we can't just have one tool, because eventually it'll get dull or it'll break and it won't work. So using, again, exercise as that only tool isn't very functional. So if we can start to incorporate a few of these tools, and for some people, like I know people who really struggle with anxiety, if like breathing and meditation gives you a ton of anxiety, don't do it. It's probably not the right tool. Try to find some other tools that can also downregulate you. So I recommend trying to like play with a few of these things and whatever, or there might be other things on here too that you do that may not be on here that are also very relevant. Writing a letter, journaling, dogs, all of those things can be really, even cooking sometimes can be really, really meditative for some people. So just find some of those things and know that you should be able to have a toolbox that has things that are going to be adaptable in multiple situations. So you shouldn't have to, if you're really stressed out and maybe you can't get out of a situation, trying to find maybe one of those things that's easy, whether that's doing a quick journal thing, if you can't go outside and go forest bathe, or you can't bust out an easel. Like find some things that are easy and really accessible for you.
Cool. And I would just say if you're like a runner, for example, if your time in nature is at your max heart rate, it doesn't quite count as chilling. So you have to make sure that workouts are okay. And I feel great after I do a mountain bike ride, but if it's a hard ride, I'm not quite getting that same parasympathetic input. So there's some context too. But this is by no means an exhaustive list. Lots of things can kind of bring the system down, but it's important to make time for it. Uh, okay, hand it over to Abby. We're going to talk about some nutrition.
Yeah. So food is life, basically. But food serves a lot of different purposes. And right now I've seen a lot of things on social media or just all around talking about stress eating and talking about how it's the worst thing ever, or COVID-19 or all of these other things, or like gaining the COVID-19. But I think that we in a Western culture have this very simplistic view of food, and we only see it as fuel oftentimes. We only see it as this exchange of you give me something, I put something out. But we have to understand that it's a lot more than that. And the fact that we do see these memes, or that we understand that people do tend to stress eat or eat more in stress. And it's not a bad thing, because we should be able to use food as a tool for coping, but again, shouldn't be your only tool. Food has always brought humans comfort. Again, it's a safety thing. If we don't have food, our body thinks that something is very, very wrong. I like to joke a lot that our bodies don't understand dieting. They just think we're dying. So think about that one for a second. But I think that that's a really, really important thing to think about, is that food should, yes, be fuel. Obviously, it should be able to get us through our day. It should be able to help us be productive. It should help us recover our bodies. But it should also be a way that we can more deeply connect with ourselves, thinking of cultural foods like cookies around Christmas, or right now it's almost Easter and Passover. So maybe some of those cultural foods are starting to speak a little bit more right now. It should also bring us together. Granted, we can't do that right now physically unless you have a quarantine. But trying to find those ways that we can come together with food. So even right now, that could be virtual, like dinners or things like that, but still trying to find a way that our food can actually bring us together. So food is a lot of things. It is much more than fuel. And actually, like when I said and joked about that your body thinks that you're dying, low intakes of overall energy, and this is kind of why the whole dieting bit doesn't work very well, is low intakes of whether it's overall energy, or if it's specific macronutrients or micronutrients. So macronutrients are carbs, protein, and fat. Micronutrients are all of your vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients, things like that. If there's ever not enough of those things, then our bodies aren't going to function as well. And if it's to a certain extent, if we drop below a threshold, which is different for everyone, that's why we can't give specific like calorie amounts or tell someone exactly what they need, because it's so individual, that if you drop below that threshold, then that's where we start to run into our body going into kind of this like reserve and stressed out mode, which then, especially in an athlete world, we see this often. We call it relative energy deficiency in sport. It used to be called the female athlete triad. I like red S because it actually gives a broader view and includes other people than females, other genders and things like that may not have female hormones. But what it does is it addresses stress, and it addresses that from an athlete standpoint, all of these different stressors are going to impact your overall performance. So one of them is definitely food, which then can cause deepening and kind of like driving yourself into this bigger hole. So restriction overall and dieting will worsen stress. So let's talk about actually how food kind of works in our body a little bit. Protein, we often think of as like I feel like the macronutrient protein has like a little halo around it. We only think that it like does good things and you can have as much protein as you want. Where that's true, like it does great things, but I also think we don't really understand it enough in our lay culture, and especially in like a more like Fitspo, like fitness culture. Everyone just thinks it builds muscle, but it does a lot more than that. So protein is basically, you can think of it as being a big block, and then it gets broken down into amino acids. So all of these little bits of amino acids are really, really important for actually making neurotransmitters. So all of the things that tell you when you're happy, when you should go to sleep, when you're sad, all of these things are going to be impacted by your protein stores. So especially when I have my guys in substance use treatment, they're coming in totally deficient in most everything. But if they come in with other co-occurring conditions, which would be like anxiety or depression or other mood disorders, not having those neurotransmitters talking and firing correctly or not being able to make them enough is going to make it so that they actually can't recover and do the work that they need to do. So when we're looking at, so yes, it builds neurotransmitters. Yes, it does rebuild muscles, but it rebuilds every single tissue in our body. So when our body is under stress, we're breaking cells down at every single moment. But when our body's under stress, what's going to happen is that rate of cell turnover is going to decrease, and we're not going to be able to make our cells efficiently and effectively, and then therefore can cause things later down the road. So good thing to think about, that protein is, yes, recovery, but also really central for brain function. The function and needs, I don't want to get too much in the weeds about how much people need. Know that the RDA, which is the recommended daily allowance set by the government, is set at an amount to not die. But most of us want to do a little bit more than not die. So I actually think the optimization, depending on what you do, if you're generally a little bit more sedentary, the 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram can be a great space to start at. If you're an athlete or an endurance athlete and utilizing and burning more, you're going to need a lot more than that. So that's more of a specific conversation. But know that if you're turning over cells rapidly, you're going to need more of that as well. You can't store protein, so our body has a lot of great storage systems for carbs and for fat, but we actually can't store protein. So there's a lot of talk in our world that the American population eats too much protein, where that is true to an extent, but they eat too much at one time. So we can only absorb about 30 grams-ish, give or take, depending on who you are, at one time. And if you're an average American who's eating a 8 to 12 ounce steak, you're maybe only going to absorb a third of that at one time. So it's not that we eat too much protein, it's really the fact that we eat too much at one time and then we are deficit for the rest of our day. So it's important to get protein in small amounts all throughout the day, again, to make sure that we can recover well and make sure that our neurotransmitters are working effectively. So when we look at that, moving on to carbohydrates, so carbohydrates generally don't get the halo of macronutrients, but carbohydrates are so essential for recovery, but also for safety. So for everyone here, generally in a female body, if we do not get enough carbohydrates, our body's going to sense that and realize that our stores are running low. And what that can do is that's going to stress us out, because our body's like, oh, hold on, I can't actually support myself. So how am I supposed to support another being? So that's where we can start to run into hormone disruptions, especially in carbohydrate intake. So carbohydrates are very, very essential for females. That could be a whole hour-long lecture, which we're not totally going to go into. But another function of them is in the brain to actually get those neurotransmitters across the blood-brain barrier into the actual tissues to where they need to be. They actually need the assistance of carbohydrates. So if we are on a very low-carb diet, we're going to start to run into major issues with actually getting those neurotransmitters to function and go to work and do the things that they need to do. So they're also the main source of energy for our brain and our muscles. So they're really, really essential for that. And especially when we're looking at carbohydrates and kind of fiber containing foods, things like that. If we're looking at more sugar-based things, not that they're bad, again, everything serves a purpose, but we find that the benefits of some of the more complex carbohydrate type things can be really great, because it can allow that longer assistance of getting proteins into the brain. So we're thinking of any sort of biochemical disruptions. Some of these more nutrient dense foods can be really great also. So fat is essential. Fat is very essential for nerve function and for brain function. Fat is broken down, utilized for energy in the body, and the brain has the highest level of concentrated fat stores in the body. There's some really interesting research on omega-3s and how they can help with inflammation in the brain overall. So they've done a few studies on stroke victims and also in soldiers post-concussive, and showing that omega-3s actually have the ability to possibly decrease inflammation. So I think that that's really cool, especially from a brain and neurochemical standpoint, because if we're looking at overall stress in the body, doesn't always equal inflammation. Inflammation is not a bad thing, but again, same thing with stress. Too much of a thing that serves a very specific purpose is not ideal. And fat should all be consumed at main meals. They're really essential for satiety. Proteins and carbs are also essential for satiety, but fats will burn for a long period of time and help tell our brains and send our brain signals that it's time to stop eating. So interesting.
And I think it's just worth hitting a nail right on the head that any of these things that are important for neural and brain function, while there might not be one study saying it's going to change your parasympathetic stress response or how you respond to stress, if your body is, all of this stuff is a cumulative load. And so if you're feeling stressed because of COVID-19, if you have a financial stress situation, if your family is a little bit stressful, and then you add the stress of a high intensity interval training workout, and then you add a stress of not getting everything you need, all of a sudden the body might be able to buffer one or multiple of those things. But this is like when all of them add up, that's when your brain just is like, I can't handle this anymore. And every little thing is a big thing. Like today when I was stressing out over the word cloud, I hadn't eaten in 3 hours. I hadn't drank enough water. And so a little thing turned into a big thing. And so I think that's a key takeaway for all these macronutrients, is that if you're missing them, your brain might not work as well, but it's just going to be another stressor that you have to buffer somehow.
Yeah, another stressor. And because I think a lot of times we're not ever taught, we're taught how to diet and we're taught all of that, but we're not actually taught how to eat and the function behind food. So also, if you ever see a diet or something that's telling you to eliminate any one of these big, large groups of foods, know that you should have some red flags going up, because if we start to eliminate one of those major sources of not only energy, but also nutrients, then huge things are possibly going to go wrong. So rounding this out with nutrition is fiber food. So I like to talk about macros, but a lot of times if we just talk about macros, we're not really, I feel like, getting a full picture of it. So fiber containing foods, especially at Evolve or with me, are all of your whole grains, fruits, and vegetables. And so a lot of those are going to be where you get the majority of your micronutrients from. So obviously you're going to get micronutrients definitely from even non-whole grains. You'll get it from meats and things like that, but you also get especially a lot of those B vitamins from whole grains, but then you're also going to get them from other nutrients like, fruits, vegetables, things like that. It's been a long day. But fiber food, so there's a difference between satiety and satiation. So satiety is basically you being able to take a pause in eating and your body being able to sustain for a period of time. And so we generally see that action from fiber and protein foods. If you've ever heard that before, of like proteins and fiber keep you full, they do. So that's where we're going to find that. But we also run into satiation, which is a little bit different. We get satiation, and satiation is going to build up throughout a meal. And that's basically the moment, once that builds up, that's like our body being like, oh, okay, I'm done, I can stop now. So that's actually going to come from carbs and fat. So that's where, in order for us to feel like we can be sustained for a period of time and be finished with food, that's where we kind of need, again, this really well-rounded idea of nutrition overall. Gut health has a huge impact on mental health as well. I don't want to get super into the weeds about it, because gut health is, again, a huge lecture, but there's a bunch of little bugs that live inside your large intestine, and for them to live and thrive, we need to be able to give them food as well. And where they get food from is from a lot of these foods that contain fiber. So they're going to get their food from our food. And if we have some sort of disruption in that, if we aren't feeding them well, then therefore they can't thrive either. So a lot of those gut bacteria are also going to talk to our brain, tell us that A, things are good and dandy, or either, hey, there's something wrong here. So we want to make sure that we're keeping those guys really happy. Many mental illnesses or chronic stress is also exacerbated by micronutrient deficiencies. So like I said, all of the reason, if you've ever heard to eat the rainbow, the reason why is because all of those different colors represent a different nutrient. So if for some reason we're running low in any of those, again, some of these other processes are going to be compromised. And so yes, energy baseline, and then we want to look at macronutrient baseline, but then we also sometimes want to look at that micronutrient baseline too, and are we in balance there, along with are we in balance of also just eating food that we really love to do too. So again, food is more than fuel. And I think it's really important to talk about food during stressful times right now. Now, especially when you're stressed, is not the time to lose weight. Really, it's never necessarily time to lose weight because, again, no matter what, it's going to stress your body out. So don't try to lose weight right now. Try not to think about the COVID-19 that you're going to gain. It's more effective that if you feel like food is one of your only tools right now and you're running to that a lot because you're stressed or because you're anxious, then we need to, again, sharpen some of those other tools and find out some other ways that we can, yes, eat food sometimes. I love Lucky Charms right now. And that's not necessarily stress food, but I'm eating more of it than I probably normally would. And that's okay. And that's fine. But again, I need to have those other tools and coping mechanisms as well. When we think about fiber, again, so going back to the different nervous systems, we have our peripheral nervous system, our arms and our legs basically, and that's going to be where a lot of the blood is shifted to when we are in a sympathetic state. And our rest and digest mode is where a lot of our blood is kind of in our core and not really being shunted elsewhere. So if we're always stressed out, that's going to take a huge, our gut's going to take a huge impact. It's going to not be able to digest food as well or absorb these nutrients. So it's one thing that if you feel like you're in this really stressed out state is to take a moment to even just decrease the fiber foods in your diet. One way you can do that is by cooking your foods really well or having some gentle soups or things like that that are easier to digest than having a huge salad every day.
Yeah, no, that one was huge for me personally when I was in grad school. I was not sleeping as much as I should have because I was training for a big race as well as finishing up my doctorate program. And I was eating a huge salad with a bunch of beans at lunch every day. And my stomach just hurt all the time. And then we switched to more soups and some softer things at lunch, still a fair bit of veggies, but just cooked. And I immediately felt much better. So just something to think about if you're getting any GI pain. Again, I'm not diagnosing that, but personal experience.
Yeah. And there's also a lot of times I find that people will inherently, if they're not feeling good, especially if they're stressed out, they want to find what that is. So they end up going to eliminating things from their diet as opposed to just chilling out for a second. And so what I really try to do is if anyone has any sort of GI issue or anything like that, before we eliminate anything ever, is the first thing we do is we try to just give themselves a little bit of gut rest and try to give them easier foods to digest. And then we can start to maybe go down the road of, oh, maybe you do have something you don't tolerate, but that's always generally the last thing I try to do, because again, if we cut anything out, we're also cutting out a lot of really beneficial things. Right now, I think it's important to also get balanced meals in. Again, trying to look at, are we getting our building blocks in? Protein, carbs, fat, fiber overall. And then are we also making room for those fun foods? We call them soul foods here at Evolve. Is again, food needs to do a lot of things. It's not just fuel, but we should start from this baseline. I work a lot with intuitive eating. And so intuitive eating, one of the main principles is giving yourself unconditional permission to eat whatever that food is, whether it's cookies or donuts, basically most of the things that you're told not to eat. And I ran across someone recently who's like, but all I'm eating is cookies and all I have is cookies in my house. And I was like, okay, so you need to give yourself unconditional permission and access to eat cookies, but you also need to give yourself unconditional permission and access to vegetables. If you don't have those in your house, you're not even giving yourself a chance. So we need to, again, come through with some balance in all of this. And I think it's important right now in this like hyper connected / disconnected state that we're in, is that we are more connected than ever, whether it's on devices or having things like this, which I think is super cool. But we can use meal times as times to hopefully step away and just take a few deep breaths, not only to calm our nervous system down and hopefully shunt some more blood into our gastrointestinal tracts, but also so we can actually enjoy the food, because most of the time we actually don't get to sit and think about the foods that we're eating, that we've spent this time preparing, especially if you're really hungry. So try to not get so hungry that you can't manage it, but also just take a few of those deep breaths and allow yourself to take about some time with your food. Maybe that's 15 minutes, maybe it's 20 minutes. Just take some time so that your brain and your body can catch up, so you can actually be satiated from that meal. And then don't restrict your food.
Any questions on nutrition before we move on? That was awesome.
Cool.
Well, think about them more. Yeah, I'm not going anywhere. So let's bring this all together. So something that I've always thinking about is, how do I incorporate some of these into a day, particularly a busy day, because a routine is only as good as it is until it if it can't stand up to a busy day, then it's not a great routine, because it's not going to be there when you really need it. And so in our 4 categories, eat, move, connect, and chill, we didn't really go over in depth on connect, but just quickly on that, that's with family and friends. So typically without devices, so you're not checking something. There was a study I saw once where people, if they even had their cell phone face down on the table, they were less engaged with the people they were with. So put the devices away if you have people living with you, and play some games, play some puzzles. Set a time for that if you have conflicting schedules. And if you are right now, it's a challenging time for people who live alone. And so if you live alone, I know like my brother does, for example, and he has a quarantine buddy that they're checking in on each other. And so there's 1 or 2 people in addition to his family that he can reach out to. So find an accountability buddy to be with you during quarantine if you live alone. Set a date for, I think group things on Zoom are good, but I found that they can get very busy. And so set time to connect with just 1 or 2 friends as well. Write letters, phone calls, it could be anything. And then also connect with yourself. And so this, again, is similar to the chill category. There's some overlap here, but find what you feel like nourishes you, whether that's art or writing or reading. Alone time for me, that's learning something new, or studying something interesting. So again, the possibilities are endless, but set some time aside to connect with yourself as well. So with those 4 categories, for me, an ideal day is I get a little bit in each one. I get to move, whether that's a harder workout or just going for a walk. I eat some nourishing food that's both healthy, but maybe something that's a little more that soul food category. I connect often. I get up about 30 minutes before Abby. Abby sprawls in the bed and connects with
with the pillows.
With the pillows. and I usually am doing some reading, and that just really fulfills me. And then today I did a couple minutes of breathing after I got stressed out by the word cloud. And so it wasn't a perfect day, but if we filter some things in here, I know I'm probably going to fall asleep pretty well tonight, and I'll wake up feeling pretty good tomorrow. And so a great day is you hit something in all 4. But most days, honestly, I'm hitting just 3 out of 4. So that's my goal for each day and for the week, is to average 3 out of 4 for this category, for each of these categories, because you don't have to be perfect, and life is life.
Because being perfect's real stressful.
Yeah, and some people love strict routines. So like I know for a while online it was like people's morning routines would go viral. They do this and this and this. That's their first 50 minutes of the day. And that idea was attractive to me, but I could never do it. And just because life has a certain element of fluidity to it. And so I think most people do better with a loose framework or a fluid template. And so that's what this is for us, is we got key pillars that we want to hit. It helps to have a plan for some of it. So Abby did an incredible workshop on meal planning last week. We'll see if we can find the YouTube link and drop it in the chat box here. But having a plan for your nutrition, at least a loose plan. So we don't plan out every single meal, but we know that the house is stocked with foods that are gonna, in this time period, last for a couple weeks. So we don't have to go to the grocery store every day, and that we can make even after the end of a long day. So we have a loose plan for our meals, and then having a workout plan as well. So that way you don't just wake up and do the next thing on Instagram or do nothing at all. So having a loose plan there can be helpful, and then figure out what are your favorite tools for connecting and down regulating or chilling. So that's how we piece it together in just a loose way, day to day. And then finally, we're going to get through this, and so we're going to get through this one way or another, hopefully together. But some other things are creating a daily schedule. Sharing your challenges with others, just feeling like you're not the only one in this can be really empowering. Having some routines, connecting with people, and then seeking out additional resources if you need it. So whether that's a counselor or a therapist, either here in town, or I'm sure there's some virtual or telehealth options now. A dietitian, Abby is an amazing one, but another one in your town. If you need help with exercise, strength training, a plan for that, or injuries, I would love to help. And then there's a ton of apps out there. Headspace is one of our favorites, but there's a lot of them out there. So whether asking for help is just getting an app or reaching out to somebody, don't try to do this alone, particularly not now.
Yeah, and Headspace is also doing, if you are a health professional or if you know a health professional, they can also share their Headspace with you. But they are offering free Headspace right now with your NPI number. I think it's also for educators too. So if you can fall in the educator category, I feel like you could probably get yourself some access to free Headspace, which is really sweet. So I want to open it up for questions for anyone right now. Anything that you had throughout the lecture. We just popped in that meal planning webinar too. So feel free to chime in and ask anything.
Sarah, are you riding your bike trainer right now?
Yes.
Love it.
Cool. That's awesome.
Oh, that's awesome.
Sweet. Well, if you guys don't have any questions, thanks for tuning in. Hopefully this was helpful in some way, shape, or form to at least, again, think about management. Oh, yeah. Sasha, what's your question?
Yeah.
It's kind of, I think it's kind of a Brian question. I don't know. So you're talking about hypersensitization and non-painful stimuli becoming painful in stress. Can you talk a little bit more about that, about what patterns you tend to see and what tends to help? Or that's just like, I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, so there's a whole range of things that can happen. So on a very simple level, there's been a number of studies that have shown that when under stressful circumstances, the body just doesn't heal as well. And so I'm pretty sure if you just go to Google Scholar and type in stress and healing, you'll probably find some things, or I can shoot you some links. But basically, they inflict a minor wound. Often it's like a something they would do for a biopsy or some type of minor, skin procedure they'll inflict, and then they'll send one group into a stressful circumstance and another group into a more relaxing one. In the group that's in the stressful circumstance will take longer, sometimes days, if not more, to heal. And so just at a basic level, stress is going to affect the rates at which our cells can heal. When we come into persistent pain, and I like that term better than chronic pain, just because I think chronic has some emotional context carried along with it. So persistent pain, pain that's lasting a long time. A couple things. One is your peripheral nervous system. So there can be what's called peripheral nervous system sensitivity, which on the far end of the spectrum is something called chronic regional pain syndrome, where basically the body is the peripheral nervous system at that area. Usually it's in the leg. Is no longer functioning properly, usually due to some type of trauma. And we see changes in the skin. We see pain to light touch. We see changes in hair growth, changes in the sweat glands. And so the nervous system runs all those things. And so it's very painful. And typically how we come out of something like that is doing some down regulation work, but then actually some mirror training. So where you essentially hide the affected limb behind a mirror and put the good one there. So it looks like you have two normal sides. And it kind of tricks your brain into thinking that that side is now okay. So it's playing more with the nervous system. Aquatic therapy can also be really helpful as a supportive environment. And then on a less severe scale, just people who have fear around movement and around their injury. So osteoarthritis in the knee is a really common one where they've done studies that your expectations of how you're going to do affect your pain. And so people who have higher levels of stress or don't expect that they're going to get better consistently report higher levels of pain. Then on the more severe scale, particularly with back pain, we see what's called central sensitivity, which basically pain is actually an output, not an input. So your inputs up into the brain from the body, it's called nociception. But the body's getting input from all of your nerves all of the time, and you can't possibly feel everything at once. So for example, the fabric on your clothes, sitting, the sensation of your feet on the floor, blinking, your heartbeat, you're not always aware of all of that. The brain decides what's relevant at any given time. And pain is essentially your body saying, this is very relevant. You need to pay attention to me and do something about it. And so with persistent, particularly spine pain, but it can happen anywhere, the body essentially gets really, really good at pain and highly sensitive. And so, with a lot of the persistent back pain that we see, the tissue injury may have passed, but every little thing that's a possible nociception input, the brain interprets as an alarm bell going off. And so we have to unwind that with novel movements, with dealing with stress and nutrition, with graded exposures. So there's a lot of ways. So anyway, really complex, and that was probably longer than you wanted. But there's a lot of different ways that the nervous system affects how we interpret and process pain. Pain is just really complex. It's not a simple A equals B equation.
I don't know. I just want to go on this for 1 second because I'm curious, and I haven't read the research on it. I would assume that if someone's ever experienced like emotional trauma, sexual trauma, emotional trauma, all of those things, that also going to impact? I mean, I would assume, and I know cognitively that I think it impacts it, but have you read research on that, of like how it impacts?
Yeah, for sure. So there's good research that any type of developmental trauma, sexual trauma, they have higher rates of mental health conditions and higher rates of persistent pain. And so there's definitely, I'm not sure if a causation has been proven, but there's definitely a correlation between all types of traumatic experiences because they affect the brain, and then that affects at a simple level. If your sympathetic nervous system is already on overdrive because of a prior trauma, you've never processed that or never come down from that, then any given input is going to be seen as more threatening. So that's kind of the theory. And there's some physical therapists as well as counselors who that's all they work with is that type of patient. Yeah, thanks Sasha for that question.
Yeah, thank you guys, both of you. As you guys know, I'm studying science in the human body right now, but those classes, they tend to give you a lot of like, this is how it works, and not so much needs. And so to hear more about, like especially the digestive system, which is so complex that it doesn't really they sort of don't go into it in a lot of your basic level physiology. And then with the nervous system, we tend to think of it just as like little zaps, like potential, and not like, what are you doing all day? Do you need a bath?
are you okay?
Right.
Totally.
Well, and I think it's crazy. So the majority of serotonin in our body is not produced in our brain. It's actually produced in our gut. So the brain gut connection, it's called the GBA axis. It is insane in how that's one of the ways that we figure out, oh, there's food in my stomach. Oh, I'm full. Oh, these proteins are breaking down. Oh, these things are satiating, but it's also constantly part of the central, they even call it the ENS, the enteric nervous system, to where it's like its own little thing to where it's just like gut brain, where they're just sending messages back and forth all the time. So it's interesting.
And I think, yeah, I just, unfortunately, the medical system, I think I'd say globally, but particularly in the United States, we just spent a whole hour and 7 minutes talking about stress, and we didn't even really cite a single paper. We're truly just scratching the surface. And I think, when we think about even managing something that's, simple or primary care sees every day, like high blood pressure, what mediates blood pressure? The sympathetic nervous system. And so, if your sympathetic nervous system is high all the time, eventually your body's going to get a new homeostatic set point, and you're going to take meds to bring it down. But could you intervene in another way? And
and can we get to that root cause before we get to those things? Can we start to look at these other kind of simple lifestyle things to actually impact, again, the physiology from the root cause point as opposed to band-aiding it?
Yeah, and that's
which, granted, medications are great. Sometimes you need them for sure, but
yeah. I think that's not to just promote Evolve, but that's core to what we believe here is that this stuff is complex, more complex than a 45-minute HIIT class or a social media post or a 7-minute primary care visit can do. And so, our membership programs, as well as just things like this that anybody can come through. We hope that over time, as somebody follows with us, they get the tools to help manage their own health. They feel like they have a team around them. Because a lot of the things that wind people up needing medications or getting hospitalized, with the exception of a virus like COVID-19 that we have less control over, a lot of things we can prevent if we understand how the body works and how we can give it the right inputs and have support and help doing that. And that we don't have to do. And if you're listening to this and you're like, oh man, I don't do any of those things. You don't have to do it all overnight. Just start with the things that feel most accessible, and then we keep having conversations and keep progressing. So that's kind of core to how we think here.
Yeah, but thanks guys for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for all your guys' questions and input. And we're doing this every Wednesday. We'll probably just do this every Wednesday just because it's kind of fun, actually.
Yeah.
So
if there's any topics you want, let us know. At some point, we're probably just going to do a Q&A session, but I know we have some more things on nutrition. I'm writing some running programs, so we might do something on that. So, but really the sky's the limit. So if there's anything you want us to dig into, let us know.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, have a great night, everybody. Stay healthy, stay safe, and we're here for you if you need anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.